With the opposition leader Peter Dutton says the government's emergency immigration detention legislation is utterly inadequate as it does not re-detain those released by the High Court decision. Live to Olivia Casely. Olivia, what will the amendments do and why does the opposition have a problem with what they've seen so far?
Well, ultimately, Tom, the opposition has made it clear that they will support this emergency legislation, which is being debated in the House as we speak. But they've made it pretty clear that they don't think that it goes far enough to protect the community from some of these individuals that include rapists and murderers that have been released into the community following that High Court decision. The opposition leader today made it pretty clear that he doesn't think that these laws are strong enough. He ultimately would like to see some changes, and he was pretty cranky that he wasn't allowed to move some of those amendments to say what he says would improve the bill. I'm told now that this bill will be debated in the Senate later today if it passes the lower house instead of tomorrow, and the coalition will try and move those amendments then. If you take a look at this graphic here, you're going to see some of the major safeguards that Labor wants to put in place. So under the powers that they're putting forward today, the individuals would be subject to ankle monitoring bracelets, strict curfews and jail sentences if their visa conditions are breached. Peter Dutton says that the government could have gone much further with this legislation and is weak on national security. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill says that's rubbish.
We are bringing forward a bill to the Parliament which gives our government powers that no government has ever had before to manage community safety risks of people in detention. Now, the leader of the opposition loves to present himself as a tough guy on the borders. He never wrote laws as tough as this, Speaker. He never wrote laws as tough as this.
The fact is that this bill should have been drafted months ago. It's inadequate in its current form. In an almost unprecedented way, we are not permitted to move amendments to this bill.
Even if this legislation passes today, Tom, there are still questions about whether it goes far enough and whether it will need to be tweaked again once the full wording of that High Court decision comes out, because that hasn't been made public just yet. And just to reiterate what I said before, it's now expected that this legislation, once it passes the lower house, will be debated in the Senate this afternoon. Tom?
Olivia, thank you. For more analysis on this, let's bring in Political Editor Andrew Clennell. So an interesting bar set from the coalition around re-detaining. I'm not sure around legality on that, but where is this at right now? And I guess the reality is, how prepared was Labor for the High Court decision?
This is a clear sign, in my opinion, Tom, that the Prime Minister's eye has been off the ball because of all these overseas trips. I think that is clear here. The government's eye has been off the ball in terms of the fact this was coming up. But last weekend, the Prime Minister knew that perhaps this might require legislation. My understanding is obviously this legislation didn't come up at Cabinet on Monday, or at least hadn't been drafted. It wasn't occurring at that point. So I believe there's either been a special Cabinet or an NSC yesterday which has passed this legislation, and I'm trying to get an answer from the government as to whether Anthony Albanese or Richard Marles was in charge of that special Cabinet. We know only Richard Marles, the Deputy Acting Prime Minister at the moment, was in caucus when it came to caucus waving this through last night. But the government had warning that these detainees might be released, that this High Court decision might go against them. And this is from the court transcript of the case involving the detainee NZYQ in June. It says, and I quote, Justice Jacqueline Gleeson says, "It seems to me that on the current state of affairs, the applicant is almost being left in a, I think, hopeless, seems to be more of an accurate assessment of his situation, than no real likelihood or prospect of being deported, that is." And she goes on, "And it does trouble me to think that while this case is before the court, no one may be turning their mind to the inevitable deterioration of a person who is in a situation of hopelessness. So I ought not to let this directions hearing go past without acknowledging the purpose of his detention is for removal, and yet it seems that on one view of the facts, capacity for removal is likely diminishing from very little to none. So I draw that to your attention as a factual matter that may ultimately be relevant." So the government, its officials, knew they could lose this case in June from the Justice's comments, Tom. It is now November, and they haven't had this response ready. In fact, the Prime Minister returned from China last week. It became an issue on the weekend. It was clear that it was going to be an issue. And in Cabinet on Monday, there was no legislation or response due to go. It's clearly opposition pressure and media pressure which has brought emergency legislation. We have this rare emergency legislation being debated in the House, the opposition not allowed to move amendments, and the Prime Minister is overseas. And not only that, it is my understanding that when the Prime Minister lands in San Francisco in about half an hour's time, he is not planning a doorstop. Well, I think the Prime Minister is duty-bound, given the seriousness of this emergency legislation, to hold a doorstop or a press conference on this when he lands in San Francisco. Here was Peter Dutton talking about the emergency nature of this legislation and the fact he can't move amendments on it this morning in the House of Representatives.
The Prime Minister has taken a decision not to re-detain these 84 serious criminals. This morning at 7:15, we get the hapless Immigration Minister and the hopeless Minister for Home Affairs in there, who moves from one disaster to the next, comes in there and says, here's the bill. They throw the bill onto the table and say, here's the bill. Will you support it? We want your bipartisan support. We said, well, there are countless provisions in this bill, and we want more than an hour and a quarter to be able to look at it, to take legal advice and to decide our position. Because we think, even on the first quick read of it, it is completely and totally inadequate. Not just are we talking about the 84 out now and the 8 about to be released, we're now talking about a pipeline of 340 people. Yep. And potentially more beyond that. Potentially more beyond that.
And so the shoe's on the other foot with this one. In 2001, John Howard introduced emergency legislation so the SAS could storm the Tampa to stop asylum seekers without punishment if someone was killed. Kim Beazley at the time decided to oppose that and said to his Chief of Staff, Michael Costello, we just lost the election, but he felt the legislation was so rushed and so loose, he couldn't let it through. Now it's Labor doing it, and the Coalition want to go harder, and some of their amendments seem to make sense, not letting these offenders go near schools, and the government won't have it. Why can't the Parliament sit this weekend to properly debate these amendments? This is a mess, I have to say, Tom. They don't look in charge. They don't look in control. It should be Richard Marles, not Claire O'Neill, out there this morning if the Prime Minister can't be. I've also heard the Prime Minister landed, I correct myself, about an hour and a quarter ago. He should be holding a doorstop on this in San Francisco. It's that serious an issue, Tom.
He previously on overseas trips has said, I don't deal with domestic issues, which was sort of a neat way of avoiding, looking like having to get down in the dumps of domestic politics. But he commented last time on a rate rise. So actually what's changed there is you will comment on domestic issues if you think you have to or they're important enough. So
that's just not going to wash.
He shifted his own
That's just not going to wash.
Hasn't he?
That's not going to wash. And the press pack there should be persistent in ensuring he answers questions on this issue and why the government has delayed a response on this issue so that they have to rush it now.
Andrew Clennell, thank you.